Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me from the great city of Cleveland or thereabouts, its environs, is one of our newest Emerging Civil War members, Brian Kowell. Brian, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Delighted to have you with us, and we'll spend a little bit of time here just spending some time getting to know you a little bit. Our main topic today is going to be Civil War horses, which is something that's of particular interest to you. That's
Yes,
why I have a picture of the Civil War Horse Memorial behind me here today.
yes.
But I got to ask you, so being in Ohio, is it still round on the ends and high in the middle?
Yes, it is. OHIO, you bet. Go Bucks. And I had to whisper that because my wife is a Michigan grad.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Them's fighting words there, aren't they?
That's fighting words. Yeah. She's a good sport though.
Oh, very good. Well, it's really great to have you with us here at Emerging Civil War, and I know folks have been enjoying the posts that you've been contributing as one of our recent contributors. Tell us a little bit about like how you became a Civil War person in the first place. What's your Civil War origin story?
Well, I got interested in the Civil War very young. I was always interested in the military and the soldiers when I was growing up, and I got a Christmas set of Mark's battleground set of blue and gray soldiers.
Ah,
And I played with those for hours and hours. And I love the uniforms. The uniforms are different from World War II, of course. And then I started reading more about the Civil War. And I just got hooked. My parents took me to Gettysburg and Sharpsburg and Harper's Ferry on a summertime trip, which just I felt like I was at home. I was running around the battlefield taking all these pictures. I read a lot. One of my favorite things is I, I I was when I was young. I actually had a uniform, a Confederate uniform. It wasn't authentic by any means, but I had the little kepi and the gray uniform. I was a Confederate back then, and I even had a sword and a little Colt revolver and a carbine. And when I was in sixth grade, I wrote a little play for our class about the surrender of at Appomattox and acted in that. It didn't go very well, but it was a lot of fun. So I've
didn't go
been
very well. Is that because the South still lost and you wanted them to win as a little young
well,
Confederate?
we were leading up to the surrender ceremony. I mean, we were telling the students how we got there. So we were talking about some like Sailor's Creek. Well, there were some of my classmates who were actors in it as well. And we were reenacting the Battle of Cedar Creek. And next thing I know, they're all dead on the floor, and I'm standing there alone. So it just, and they weren't supposed to do that. So I had to go on all by myself and finish up the whole play.
Very good, very good. So I
Yeah.
see Appomattox on the wall behind you there. I can't tell what the picture is above the.
That's the crater. It's
Oh, yeah,
Elder's. I
okay.
think it's Elder's picture of the crater. And I've got a around the corner. I've got a picture of Kilpatrick because I have an interest in him. I've got a picture on the other wall of Jeb Stuart riding around McClellan's army there, the famous one. And that they used that for a cover for an article that I got published in America's Civil War way back when.
Okay,
I've
okay.
got Jackson on a little sorrel back there. I've got all
I'm
sorts of
seeing a
stuff.
horse theme developing here as you're talking about some of these.
Yeah, I love Civil War horses.
We'll get to that in just a second. Now, I know horses are one of many of your areas of interest. You have a particular interest in cavalry. Um, tell us you tell us about this wide range of interests you have as a scholar and as someone who's been writing and researching and
Well,
exploring.
I read a lot. In fact, every Christmas I fill up my library with Christmas gifts, and I order a lot. In fact, right now I'm reading this.
Hey,
Yeah, that's
you,
pretty
you get the
cool.
Chris Mikowski stamp of approval on that.
That's right. And I mean, I read a lot of Navy stuff. I got interested in Pook's turtles. I thought they were just fascinating machines. And I read about a lot of that. So the naval aspect I got involved with, um, uh, all sorts of different things. And the trouble is, I get involved with it and I go down a rabbit hole. So, like a lot of people, you you see something and you want to know more about it. Um, I always say if you really love something passionately, you want to know as much about it as you can. And so that's what I am with my wife and my Civil War.
I'm glad you got that in the right order there too.
You bet, I did.
So you come to us most recently from the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with that group.
Yeah, I've been a member of I'm been a member of it for 49 years. So I've been, yeah, a long
Yeah,
time.
I would say you didn't look that old, so
Well, thank you.
you must have joined when you were two. Is that it?
I wish I was too. It was interesting the way I joined the group. I was a pharmaceutical salesman for 3M Pharmaceuticals. I had a biology degree from college and a teaching degree as well. And I never taught a day in my life, but I did get a job in pharmaceutical sales. So I was calling on a physician one day, and I'm sitting at his office talking to him, and over his shoulder was a picture, that famous picture of Grant leaning on the tree. I think it was outside of Cold Harbor,
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
So I think I spent more time talking about Cold Harbor and Grant and with the doctor than I did my drugs. And so he says, you know your stuff. Would you like to come to a meeting? So one thing led to another, and I've been a member of the Civil War Roundtable in Cleveland ever since. I went through the ranks and became president and newsletter editor for a while, and I've led a number of different field trips, and it's been a ball. In fact, we have our meeting tonight. I'm going to see a friend of ours,
Oh,
Brian
very good.
Matthew.
Brian Matthew Jordan.
He's going to be speaking tonight on this book, so I'm got it all out here, ready to get it autographed.
Oh, very good. Very good. I actually owe one of your colleagues some paperwork for an upcoming trip I have. So tell him I haven't forgotten about that.
Oh, okay, I'll do that. I'll do that. Great. You're going to come to our round table then?
I'll be heading up there. My mother actually lives in Ashtabula, Ohio. So any chance I can get to the Buckeye State is welcome. Just then I can go do my role as dutiful son and show up and visit with my mom for a little bit.
Great. That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
So Ohio's got a great Civil War history. So, I know there's a lot of stuff to pique your interest as you were growing up and getting older and places to visit and personalities to get to know. Anything particular about Ohio's Civil War history that has resonated strongly with you?
Well, I found an interest. I was researching the 21st Ohio, which, of course, for all the Civil War buffs, know they defended on Snodgrass Hill during the Battle of Chickamauga. But I looked into their history, and their colonel and their lieutenant colonel were very interesting to me because when they were stationed in Alabama early in the war, um, it was a soft war back then. It wasn't a hard war where they were confiscating a lot of the Confederate. They were treating the Confederates nice, and these two guys, especially treated them nice. And a lot of their troopers, a lot of their soldiers didn't like it much. And in fact, the colonel used to stay at a fellow's resident's house
Oh,
instead of in camp. Yeah. And so I got interested in that, the 21st Ohio. And of course, Ohio is famous for a lot of Civil War generals: McPherson, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, all have a tie here in Ohio. Ewing, I could go on.
yeah. I think my connection with Ohio, Civil War wise, is certainly the Grant Homestead Association and the great little sites that they have down there and
Yeah,
outside of Cincinnati. Just some really neat stuff. And my other kind of favorite Ohio connection is the 126th Ohio Infantry because they have a monument out at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and so that's just sort of
yes,
been on my literally on my radar screen and landscape for a long time. So
yeah,
great
yeah.
regiment. So we promised people would talk about Civil War horses, and I know you've got a super big interest in that. So let's shift gears just a little bit.
Okay.
What is it that got you interested in horses of all things? Which and I say of all things, they're the engines that drive the armies, so that's not
Yes.
a small topic.
Yeah, it's not small stuff. Well, I got shamed into it actually. Yeah, I was on a field trip down in the Shenandoah Valley with our Civil War Roundtable, and we had a guide, Dennis Fry, was leading us around, and he took us down. We were studying Jackson's Valley campaign. And he took us down to Means Bottom, And for those of you who don't know, Means Bottom is a low ground area. There's a water course that goes through there, and there's a covered bridge that went across. And it was kind of a dividing line between the Northern forces, Banks's forces, and Jackson's. And who was defending that but Turner Ashby and his troopers? And he was on his famous horse at that point. So Dennis gave us a narrative of the horse and how this horse actually saved Turner Ashby as the Confederates, as the Yankees came down to try to get control of the horse. Turner Ashby had set up his troopers to burn the bridge, but he held off some Yankee troopers on their side of the river with his horse while the bridge was in flames. And then at the last moment, he rode across his horse through the flaming bridge and up the hill back into the Confederate lines, successfully stopping the Confederates from any more pursuit. So then Dennis turned to the group and said, "Does anybody know the name of Jackson or Ashby's horse?" And nobody spoke up except me.
Ah.
And I had been doing some homework the night before and it was fresh in my mind. And I says, "Tom Telegraph." So everybody looked at me like, and Dennis even says, "You are the only person that's ever come up with that name. I've taken all these people here, and you're the first one to come up with that." So that impressed my friends, and I felt pretty proud about that. Well, the trouble is, your fellow roundtable members can be your toughest critics. So we were on a subsequent field trip down to Monocacy. So we're talking about that battle, and one of my colleagues turns to me and says, "Okay, Brian, you know horses. What was the name of Lew Wallace's horse?" I had no idea, but I know this guy's name was John, and I figured I just blurted out, "Well, the horse's name is John," because I figured that he's going to be horse's ass to me. Well, I'm going to put it name him John. So I come to find out Lew Wallace's horse's name was John. After that, I was the club's horse expert. So that's how I shamed into it.
So it wasn't just the horse's ass, but the whole horse was.
Yeah, that's right. It was a whole horse.
Good.
Yeah.
So you come up with these on the spot horse names. How does that evolve into a study of Civil War horses for you?
Well, then I've always been interested in the cavalry, and then they, as you pointed out, a lot of these generals and generals' horses became famous, and I read up about those. And then the common soldier, I started reading about their horses, and they named them all. Of course, most of the soldiers' horses are lost to history. We only remember the generals' horses. Although I started compiling a whole list. I've got a whole list on the computer of horses, even down to some privates. Any book I read that has something that says about horses, I make a note of it and put it in there. And the interesting thing on page 19 of your book talked about Major Bread and his the two guns that were holding off the Union troops at Spindle Field. Well, that was a fantastic story because I do incorporate the artillery horses in my talk. So it's just fascinating how it all gets tied in. And then there's differences between the North and the South as far as horses. When I was young, I was very interested in the Confederate cavalry. These were all the glamorous guys. Turner Ashby, Jeb Stuart, Forrest, Morgan. Oh man, these guys are fantastic. Well, who do they have in the North? And I started looking around, and there weren't all that many of them, at least not for a 10 to 15-year-old boy. But as I got older, yeah, there were some darn good Union cavalry officers, Buford, Gregg, and then some infamous ones like Kilpatrick and Pleasanton. And I was very fond of Kilpatrick. I thought, what a fascinating character. Because when I look at things, sometimes I don't, I look for the quirkiness in a person or a situation or a battle and say, boy, that's unique. That's a story. So that's how I got interested in Kilpatrick and what he's done. So that's how I got into it. And then the way the Confederate cavalry was formed was a lot different from the way the Union cavalry was formed. Um, as you know, the Confederate cavalry, they had a lot of the troopers um, were born and raised on with horses and rode horses a lot, and that wasn't the case in the North. And in the South also, when they went to war, the Confederate government stipulated that they would get artillery horses and draft horses for the wagons, but for cavalry, the troopers had to bring their own horses, and you had to bring your own tack. So a lot of these troopers were on thoroughbred horses, really good animals, and they could ride and they could jump. The trouble they were given a stipulation of 40 cents a day to feed these horses and take care of them. And the troopers, I guess most of them knew how to take care of horses. But the interesting thing in the South is a lot of these troopers in the cavalry would bring their servants up. So there were a lot of black slaves that were actually taking care of these horses and not the troopers themselves. But
Which are kind of an ironic problem too, because as the war goes on and the army has a tougher and tougher time of feeding itself, you've got these extra mouths to feed, and the forage required for the horses is also a huge problem. So,
yes,
it really kind of magnifies uh, some of the deprivations that the Southern armies have to go through as the war goes on.
yes, and the trouble is that the horse it stipulated that at the beginning the trooper, Confederate trooper, would have his horse appraised, and the price of horses, the cost of horses back then was on an average $125 a horse, but thoroughbreds could go up, quite a bit more than that. In fact, the most expensive horse that was ever bought just before during the Civil War or early in the Civil War was Joe Hooker's horse, which he spent $1,000 for his horse.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a lot of money back then. Um, the trouble is that if the horse was killed, the trooper would be reimbursed for that amount. And then he would have to go back home and be furloughed and get another horse. So that was a two-edged sword because now you got a trooper out of the saddle. Your regiment's getting depleted because we have less troopers there, and you're going back and getting maybe an inferior grade horse. Um, and the other thing is that taking care of these horses, as you point out, it takes a lot of care. And these horses, if you don't take care of them, they get sick. And when they get lame and sick, it's a problem. And the Confederate, if the horse dies from lameness or sickness, they don't reimburse.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's a story about one Confederate trooper who actually thought about, his horse was sick. Hey, how am I going to cash in on this? I'm going to be in trouble here. Maybe I should take him out to the picket line and maybe he'll get accidentally shot by the Yankees. And some of the troopers who lost their horses would have to sneak into Union lines. They got permission from their officers. Yeah, go into Union lines and see what you could steal. And they ran the risk of getting captured themselves. Grumble Jones said after the Battle of Brandy Station that his men were better mounted and better equipped after that battle than before because of all the saddles and things that they gleaned from the Union cavalry during that battle. So yeah, there was a lot the troopers had to do.
Thinking too about if a guy loses his horse, he has to go home and get a new one. And I was also just kind of thinking like if his horse had been appraised at $200 when he first went in, well, the prices of horses goes up over the course of the war because horses become more scarce, and as you say, the quality of horses goes down, and so that $200 doesn't buy him the same horse when he goes back home.
No, it doesn't at all, and it's very tough. I mean, there were even incidences where some troopers would steal from one another. There's an incident where Heros Bork, Stuart's staff officer, big, big officer, one of his horses was stolen. And they found out it was stolen by a trooper because one of the servants in the camp noticed the horse in one of the cavalry camps, and he got it back for von Bork. But yeah, they would steal. And of course, one of the raids that Stuart had, the Chambersburg raid, was really a horse gathering raid. His second ride around McClellan, and horses in that campaign really was one of the causes that McClellan got canned.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, October of 1862, and McClellan was off meeting his wife, so he wasn't even on duty paying attention like he was supposed to be. So that was especially embarrassing to him.
Right. And Lincoln, of course, was very upset that the Army wasn't pursuing Lee. And of course, McClellan gave the excuse, well, I can't because all my horses are worn down and fatigued. And then Stuart rides around him. And Lincoln says, could you tell me what your Army horses are doing that they're so, tired and fatigued? And he couldn't answer. But that was a little feather on top that was the collapse of McClellan's fall.
Yeah, one of those great moments of exasperation Lincoln has with McClellan
Yeah.
throughout the war. So we've talked a lot about Southern cavalry and their horses, but I know that cavalry is not the only part of the army that's using horses. Tell us a little bit about how else horses are used in both armies.
Well, horses are draft animals. You have a lot of draft animals, and you have artillery, other uses for the horses. The armies really ran on horsepower and mule power. Yes, there were trains, but to get once you're in the campaign, a lot of times you weren't close enough to a railroad to have quick access, and you'd still have to haul supplies. I mean, if you think about the overland campaign that you wrote about, I mean, Fredericksburg was probably, and Culpeper, they were getting a lot of their supplies still from Culpeper, which was on a railroad, the Orange and Alexander. But that was a long way for horses and mule teams to haul supplies and ammunition, equipment, pontoon boats, medicine, ambulances, everything that the Army needs was pulled by horses or mules. So it was very important. Um, and the Union acquisition of horses was a little bit different than the Confederates, um, and they established horse depots after a while. They had a number of them. Probably the most famous is the Geesboro one outside of Washington D.C. And there were horses could be trained there, sick horses could be taken there, and it brings up a very interesting point about Civil War horses and their care is there was only one veterinary college in the United States before 1861, and that was in Philadelphia. And during the war, there were only 50, I believe, trained veterinarians in the country, and most of those were foreign trained. So a lot of these horses had to be taken care of by farriers, which were they would take care of putting the shoes on the horses and taking care of horses that were sick. Um, Artillery horses, I mentioned, were very important. And they were usually larger than the regular cavalry horses, stronger in the shoulders. So they could have, I mean, six horses had to draw, what, 3,800 pounds of equipment across a battlefield, sometimes at a gallop. And they were larger and they were targeted. Uh, they were big targets for the opposing armies. You knock down all the horses, and then you can capture the guns. They can't move. And there's all sorts of stories. The one that you had in your book, and there's another one that I tell in some of my talks that one artillery battery, they were trying to get off the field, and they were down to one horse, and this artillery sergeant is trying to, by the bridle, lead this horse and cannon off the field. A Confederate bullet hit the horse in the rear end, and that horse took off. That gun got off the field, and that was the only way. But one horse took one cannon off the field. It was amazing.
Wow, wow. I want to go back to something you talked about a second ago with the sort of the different ways that the North procured horses versus the South, and kind of going back to the example you used with Confederate cavalry bringing their own horses to the field with them. And so, these are guys that have relationships with their horses. They know how to take care of their horses. Whereas in the North, where you have these centralized procurement areas and you sort of get the government issued horse if you're in the cavalry. And that's a
That's right.
different relationship you have with the horse than if it comes from your own barn. Did that create problems for federal cavalry in particular? Like, and it's not like everybody in the North were strangers to agriculture, strangers to horses. People knew
Right.
horses as part of their daily lives. But the kind of relationship you have with the horse is different if you own it versus if it's issued to you.
Right, right. It caused a lot of problems. At the beginning of the first thing it caused was at the beginning of the war, they had to get inspectors to approve the horses because the governments are putting out contracts. We need to buy 400 horses at this depot, say in Cairo, Illinois. The horse dealers would bring the horses in, but the inspectors, there weren't that many in the army. So the quartermasters had to hire a lot of civilians, people who they so-called trusted, and this left a lot of room for graft. A lot of these inspectors were crooked as hell. Horses would come in all different shapes, some blind, some spaven. Good horse dealer knows with a little bit of laudanum, it could make an old horse seem young and a lame horse, distempered horse, seem calm. So there was a lot of graft during the Civil War. There's a story about one quartermaster in Cairo, Illinois, who, as the war went on, would as the horses were captured and brought up to his depot, he would take the good ones, and he had his own little farm there, and he would have the old and sick horses sold to the government. And when the price of horses went up, then he would get his good stock and sell it to the government. So he was making like 100% profit on these horses. Um, so the other thing with the problem that came up was the horses were just, some of them were just as green as the soldiers at the beginning of the war. Some of them had never had a saddle on them. And a lot of the troopers, they were familiar with horses and maybe some care of horses, but usually that was from behind a plow or a buggy. A lot of them didn't ride horses regularly, at least not thoroughbreds. So these two green units, the horse and the rider, had to come together. And there are all sorts of stories about companies being up for inspection and the colonel coming out and say, it takes a while for them to get in line. And they're all up on top of their horse. And he says, okay, let's draw sabers. And the noise of the saber comes out, the rattling sound, and the horses are spooked and they run, they rear, they jump, they roll down, and these troopers are thrown all over the place. There are a lot of troopers who got hurt by horses.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of problems at the beginning with the Union Army, and they had to learn how to take care of these horses. You have to learn how to brush a horse. The horse gets hot, worn out, and a long campaign. There's a certain way of brushing it to cool it down. If you don't do this, the horse is very susceptible to diseases. And again, you don't own your own horse. Maybe you don't have that attachment to that horse. Oh, he's sick. I don't know what to do. Okay, well, I'll just go get another one. It's kind of like our disposable society today.
Yeah.
But it didn't work that well. There was always a problem with Montgomery Meigs complaining about the care of cavalry and artillery horses throughout the armies, east and west. So that became a big problem. There was a story about and it's always an Irish trooper. An Irish trooper gets issued a brand new horse. And for Union soldiers, usually this was to make it fair, they did it as a lottery. So this captain brings over the horse to this Irish trooper, and here's your horse. And the trooper looks at him and opens up his mouth and looks at his mouth and says, and then steps back and doffs his cap and kneels down and bows to the horse. And the captain says, why are you doing that? In respect to old age, sir. Yours are just over age. So there's a lot of funny incidents like that.
As a former horse owner myself, my daughter still owns horses. I'll say that there are fewer things more relaxing than just brushing the horse down at the end of the day. And, so that's a really good bonding experience for a rider and a horse as well. And
Yes.
again, kind of thinking about the circumstances that these guys are operating under, there's an opportunity for some of these troopers to bond with their horses and maybe, don't understand that, don't take advantage of that, just because they're not experienced in taking care of horses on the round.
Yes, there's a definite bond between the horse and the rider for most of them anyway. I mean, they would name their horses. There was there was a fella in the Michigan Cavalry Regiment in Custer's command. He had four horses during the course of the war, and he had four different names of them. Bobby, I mean, Taylor was one, Bucephalus was another one, and the last one was Jimmy Crack Corn. But the horse and the rider became one. The horse relied on the rider, and the rider relied on the horse. And some of the horses were smarter than the riders. They had to react to bugle calls, and some of the horses would pick up on the bugle calls a lot quicker than some of those country boys. So yeah, the big bond. You read about stories of these horses getting them out of trouble, uh, uh, carrying them out of danger, and you just love your horse for that. And troopers crying when they'd have to put down a horse. Um, there's stories of, well, one, Orlando Wilcox was wounded at the first battle of Bull Run, and he was mounted on his horse. He and his horse were both wounded. And as he was being led off the field by his fellow officer, the horse was trotting right behind him, like a dog would follow you. There's stories about troopers who, when they would stop and rest because they would be fatigued, maybe on a raid, that they would let their horses graze, and the horse would graze right around them without leaving, and they would be right there for them. Of course, there's other horses that would just take off too. So each one was individual.
Yeah. You mentioned that story about Orlando Wilcox, and I think about not to spoil the Spotsylvania book you're reading, but when James Rice is mortally wounded on the 10th of May, and he's seen going out onto the field on this magnificent black charger, and he's very um, um, uh, recognizable out there, and a few minutes later, people see stretcher bearers bringing him off the field, and the horses following the stretcher bearers as they're taking him to the rear, and the horse survived. But showing that loyalty, almost like a dog following his master, kind of thing. And
Yeah.
those are always such poignant stories to me, because it does show that emotional bond that exists between rider and horse.
Well, that was the interesting thing about the Mosby, or not the Mosby, but the Turner Ashby story. When he crossed that bridge, his horse took two bullet holes. He got shot twice, and Tom Telegraph made it up the hill. And when he made it up the hill, he collapsed. And Henry Kidd Douglas writes a very emotional story or excerpt about Mosby leaning over his dying horse, stroking him, looking him into the eye, and missing him, and then the horse passes away, and Turner Ashby gets up and leaves the horse. And then his troopers come in. And this horse was so famous in both armies, a big white horse. You could see it for miles, that they took souvenirs from his mane and from his tail. And they actually took a hoof. There is one of Turner Ashby's horse's hooves is in the Museum of the Confederacy. Oh. And it was donated there by a fellow who was a pharmacist. He had a drugstore in New Market, and he got a hold of this hoof and put it on a plaque and labeled it. And he had it in his drugstore for years down in New Market before he donated it to the Museum of the Confederacy. All sorts of different stories about horses.
That is one I haven't heard. And, because of my interest in the stuffed remains of Little Sorrel at VMI, I have tracked down famous horse remains for years, and I have not heard that one. So now I'm going to have to go down to Richmond and take a look for Tom Telegraph's hoof.
Well, then you're obviously familiar with Meade's horse, Old Baldy, and his remains are in Philadelphia. They've got the head. Old Baldy was a very interesting horse because some people say he was wounded 7 times during the war, others as many as 14 times. He was wounded pretty badly at the second day at Gettysburg. I don't know whether it was a shell or a bullet that hit him in the stomach, but Meade had to dismount and had him taken back and taken to a farm to recover, and he did recover. And at that battle, at July 2nd, of course, everybody knows that Sickles goes out um, ahead of the Union line. And this Meade goes out there, sees this, and he has to get a horse to go out there and inspect this. Well, he borrows Alfred Pleasanton's horse. Pleasanton was the chief of cavalry back then. And Pleasanton's horse bolts. Uh, Bolt means the horse takes the bit in its teeth and takes off. It gets in its mind that it wants to run, it's going to run. And that's what it did with Meade. And Meade, lucky enough, was good enough to yank the bit back in time before he went into Confederate lines. So he got the horse under control and came back. But to get back to Baldy's remains, it's interesting that when the horse marched behind the funeral of General Meade in Philadelphia, and when the horse died, it was buried as well. And the story or the legend goes that there were two troopers that went back into his grave and dug up his head and his hooves. And I don't know whether they sold it for profit or whether they wanted to give it as a souvenir, but that's how that head and stuffed head and hooves got put up in the Philadelphia Civil War Roundtable there.
Yeah, it's poor Baldy. Only his head remains.
Yeah, of course, Rienzi. You've been to Washington D.C. You go into
Yep.
the Smithsonian Institute, and they've got Rienzi. He's stuffed there. Um,
So
famous
Phil Sheridan's horse that he famously rides to the Third Battle of Winchester and helps rally the troops, and the tide turns and becomes an important victory to help with Lincoln's reelection. So Sheridan renames his horse Winchester in honor of that ride,
yeah.
and he has the horse mounted and stuff, and it's on display. Tell us a little bit about how we can see Rienzi.
Yes, yeah, it was very interesting because Rienzi got its name. That horse was given to Sheridan when he was in Mississippi. The second troopers of the Second Michigan Cavalry captured the horse or got the horse and gave it as a gift to Sheridan because they wanted him to be the colonel of their or the brigadier general of their brigade, and they presented him with the horse, so he named it Rienzi. And the horse named was Rienzi until he was Winchester. Yeah, he was changed then. Yeah,
Yeah. So you can see him on
interesting.
display at the Museum of American History at the Smithsonian as part of the America at War exhibit, and
Yeah,
one of just I think five. Let me see if I remember this right. One of five fully mounted horses from military heroes in the world. Little Sorrel of Stonewall Jackson being another one. I think there's one of Custer's horses out west, one of
is there?
Napoleon's, and I can't remember the fifth one. And then there's Baldy's head, which is only
Yeah, Baldy's head.
I had this.
Beautiful.
This is all written out in my last days of Stonewall Jackson.
Yeah,
Could have freshened up. Another famous horseman, Nathan Bedford Forrest. We don't have a lot of stories of him having like these close relationships with some of his horses, like a Phil Sheridan or Rienzi or a Jackson and a Little Sorrel, because he seems to go through so many horses.
that's exactly right. He of all from what I can find, he had the most horses shot from under him during the Civil War, more than any Union commander. I think the next one was maybe Custer, who had a lot of horses shot under him, and General Lovell, another cavalry. But Forrest just went through horses left and right. His favorite horse, though, was named Roderick, and Roderick was a good horse. He was killed at Thompson Station when Horace Forrest was surrounded, and that's where he made that famous say, "Charge them both ways." Well, Roderick got wounded both ways, I think, but he wouldn't leave. Forrest dismounted when he got wounded and tried to send him to the rear. Of course, there was no rear there, but the horse kept coming back to him, uh, kept coming back to Forrest's side, um, and um, he eventually died. Um, and Roderick, though, has a statue to him, just like the statue that the horse behind you. He has a lone statue, and it's very unusual to have just a statue to a horse. But Roderick has a statue at Thompson Station. I've got a picture of it someplace, and it was really a cool story. The other cool story about Forrest, with one of his horses dying, after the Battle of Chickamauga, his cavalry went out to pursue Rosecrans' fleeing army into Chattanooga, and they were following the Union Army towards Missionary Ridge, and his horse got shot in the neck. And Forrest is at a gallop, and he's closing in, and here's blood spurting out of the neck of the horse, and he doesn't want to stop, so he takes his gauntlet finger and stuck it into the horse's throat to keep the horse alive until he could make sure that the his troopers pushed the Yankees back into Chattanooga. I thought that was a great story too.
So I think the statue of Roderick at Thompson Station is just north of Spring Hill in Tennessee. If folks get it, it's on private
There you
property,
go.
so you can't get to it quite so easily. But it is. I've got pictures of it from off in the distance. I was
Yeah.
just down there last week actually, and then Parker's Crossroad I think is where he does the charge him both ways story.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, but and I only mentioned that because the great folks at Parker's Crossroads gave me a tour there and were just wonderful, wonderful hosts. But I think Forrest famously says, I can't remember the number, but like, he lost 30 horses, but he shot himself 31 Yankees, so he came out one ahead or
Yeah,
something
went
like that.
ahead. Yes.
Yeah, and like that goes to show just, kind of how disposable horses were at times too, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah, they were a commodity. You just grabbed another horse. Of course, when an officer was dismounted with his horse in battle, usually a trooper would come by and let him borrow another horse because you had to have the commanding officer mounted at all times. And it was the trooper's idea. He had to go get another horse. So he would maybe grab another saddle someplace because tack and saddles were hard to come by too, and they got worn out. That was more of a problem for the Confederates than the Yankees because the Yankees had manufacturing; they could manufacture more. Um, so yeah, there was a lot of that going on.
And we,
Um,
we talk about like relationships that some of these famous generals have with their famous horses and Stonewall Jackson, Little Sorrel. But most of these generals had more than one horse, and they maybe had a favorite or one that's become favorite. But like if you just rode the same horse all the time, particularly as active as many of these generals had to be in command, that's just too much work for the horse. Tell me about that idea of guys having multiple horses and kind of rotating them through and that.
yeah, a lot of the officers, especially the generals, would have multiple horses. The cavalry colonels would. Anybody, they'd pick up extra horses and not turn them over to the government necessarily. Um, for example, William T. Sherman had at least 3 or 4 horses during the war. Um, his favorite was Duke. And you could see if you look at the picture in the magazines or books of Sherman astride his horse outside of the Atlanta
uh,
fortifications after it fell. That was Duke. That was his favorite horse. He had you could tell Duke because he had like a white star in his forehead and his left back hoof was white. And Sherman loved this horse so much that after the war, he had a picture of it over his desk in his office. Dolly was another one of his horses, but Dolly was captured at Collierville. Um, uh, Sherman and his staff were taking a train to a Union outpost near Collierville when General Chalmers, Confederate general, attacked. And they had to get off the train quickly. And the horses were left back in the train. And Sherman and the officers ran into the fortifications and they actually fended off the Confederates, but not until the Confederates stole the horses. So Dolly was stolen. And Sherman wasn't too upset about it because Dolly had a temper. And Sherman says, whoever caught that, he deserves to catch it. I can't wait to see what happens when he sits on that horse. He's in for a surprise. Another general, of course, Union general who had a number of horses was McClellan. McClellan's favorite horse was Daniel Webster. And McClellan was small. He had that Napoleonic complex. But all his horses had to be 17 hands high, which is tall for a horse. And Daniel Webster was his favorite. It was a black horse. And Daniel Webster, he had a strong gait. He had a fast gait, and his whole staff hated it because whenever they had to follow him, they were at a gallop, and old McClellan and Daniel Webster just trotting along. And so they used to call the staff called him, gave him the name of Devil Dan. And one of the staff officers, Strother, later said, seeing Devil Dan at the picket line, he said, that horse is just darn right mean. He's kicking the other horses, and that's every horse has their own personality. The other horse that McClellan had was a horse by the name of Burns. And he got that name because it was a gift to him by General Ambrose Burnside. So he named him after Burns. And Burns had a problem, though. The horse had a problem. Maybe the general did too, but Burns had a problem. And Burns's problem was he was a chowhound. When it came time to eat, he went to the stable to eat, and nothing would stop him. So McClellan had to be very careful when he was riding this horse. If it was around dinner time, he'd have to dismount and get on a different horse because this horse would just take off to the chow line. His other horse was named Kentuck. So yeah, a number of different horses that they use. Horses become fatigued. You can't ride them every single day. You hear a lot of stories about that when these Union and Confederate cavalry are going on these long raids, and they're wearing out horses and trying to replace them. And here you have a thoroughbred horse or a really good horse, and he's just being worn out. And you have to find a horse along the way, and sometimes the horse isn't of as good a quality. And sometimes you lose your horse on a raid because you don't want it falling into the enemy's hands. This happened on a number of occasions. A famous occasion was the Battle of Trevelyan, when Sheridan was going back to Union lines after that battle. Any horse that was worn out, he ordered them, they had to be shot. So the attack taken. So you'd see all these cavalry troopers trotting along behind troopers who were still mounted, carrying their saddles until they could find another horse. Yeah. So a lot of different horses that they had.
Yeah, I think about Grant in Cincinnati. He had several horses, and he was an excellent horseman, and so he was very discerning about the horses that he got too. And
Yes.
then the flip side, is Stonewall Jackson, who looked super awkward on a horse, although he was an excellent horseman as well. His uncle had a racing racetrack, and so Jackson was around horses his whole life growing up, and you'd think he'd have looked a little smoother.
Yes. Yeah. Especially the cavalry, they had a number of horses. You get a horse shot, you have to have it replaced. Another Meade had another one. His name was Blackie. That was another horse that he had. I talk about Morgan and his raid. His favorite horse was a beautiful black thoroughbred named Black Bess, and he rode it during the raid. And he was at one point his cavalry was surprised by the Union cavalry and pursued. And they came up to the Cumberland River, and they had to cross the river to escape. And there's some question on their way to the river whether Morgan was actually riding the horse, or the horse took the bit in the mouth and took off towards the river. But once they got to the river, they couldn't cross with the horses. And that's where Morgan lost his favorite horse, Black Bess. He had to leave it behind. So some Union trooper got lucky and got that horse.
Now, one of my favorite little horse bits of trivia of the Civil War is the statue of Morgan that used to be in downtown Lexington. It's
Yeah.
now at Morgan's grave in the cemetery in Lexington. It has him on Black Bess, but when the sculptor created that statue, he thought that it was unbecoming that a hero like Morgan should be on a mare, and so they gave Black Bess testicles on the
Yes.
statue.
Yeah. Can you believe that? And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, raised money for this statue, and it was about $15,000 at that time. A lot of money for that horse. And they unveil it, and they're shocked And the follow-up story, it became a custom for students at the University of Kentucky to, as a prank, to once a year paint the balls of black pest. I don't think that happens at the cemetery anymore. I don't know that.
Yeah, although I would not attest to it.
No,
One way
I
or
wouldn't
another,
attest to that either.
right? So, we're kind of having some good laughs about these and talking about these great relationships that people had with their horses. But, as the statue behind me attests, horses paid a terrible toll over the course of the war,
Yes,
and mules as well. We haven't even really talked about those.
right.
Um, what's the ultimate impact on horses as the engines of the armies? What sort of toll do they end up paying?
Well, it was vast. It was really terrible. I mean, a lot of students of the Civil War know that there were a lot of men, troops killed during the Civil War. And the estimate is anywhere between 650,000 to as high as 850,000 men who perished during the Civil War. Well, the horses suffered too. Uh, 1.5 million horses were killed during the Civil War. And you look at some of these pictures, like you see Trossel Farm, all these horses that were strewn along there. And again at Gettysburg, at the widow Leicester's house, where Meade had his horses and the staff, they were all wiped out during the bombardment. I mean, they just had they paid a terrible price during the war. And that's why that statue, that picture behind you is so significant. And there are four. Now you can correct me on this. There are four of those, from what I understand, around the country.
I know of three. There's the one that's at the Virginia
Museum
Museum
of
of History and
History
Culture in Richmond. There's one at the National Sporting Museum up in Middleburg, Virginia, and then there's one out at I think it's Camp Leavenworth out in
in
Kansas.
Kansas. I
So if
I
there's a fourth, I don't know where it's at.
I was, and I'm not sure about this. That's why I thought maybe I'd ask you. I thought there was a fourth, or came across an account that there's possibly a fourth on a private property outside of the Bentonville battlefield
So
down
there
in
is a
Virginia.
horse memorial. It's not a replica of this statue,
Ah,
but so
okay.
it's if you go and see the Joe Johnson statue where he's pointing like this, the house next to that property actually has, I think it's a bronze head of a horse that serves as a horse memorial. So
Ah,
it is.
okay,
So there
good.
is one that's out there at Bentonville. It's just not a replica of this or a duplicate of this statue here. But that's a good little bit of trivia. I'd have forgotten to mention that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, I haven't asked, are you do you ride yourself? Do you own horses?
I think I've been on a horse twice,
Okay.
and that's when I was young. That's about it. It's interesting you should ask though, because I have a friend down the street. I live in Hinckley, Ohio, which is kind of a rural area in Medina County, just south of Cleveland. And there are horses. There's a horse stable right behind my property. And sometimes those horse flies when I mow the lawn in the summer aren't too nice. But I have a neighbor down the street who has a horse there. And we went just on Monday to see his horse, Apollo.
Oh.
And he showed me around the horse. And so I'm interested in it. But no, I don't ride. Don't
So
ride.
that's and the reason I ask is because at least you've taken the time to go familiarize yourself with horses. You've had that experience, and that's one thing I think that as people study the cavalry or read about it, but without actually knowing what a horse is like and being on a horse and understanding how powerful horse is and how
Yes.
uncontrollable horse can be, they do have minds of their own. Like you can't really appreciate cavalry operations until you really, I think, have exposed yourself to horses like that because that's a whole aspect, a whole dimension of that study that I don't think
Yeah.
people really understand.
Yeah, and then horses have to be acclimatized. I mean, you just don't throw a horse in with a bunch of other horses. There was a lot of accounts at Giesboro where a horse would come in and they would put it out. They'd have to keep it separate. And I noticed this on Monday. Apollo was in a separate little corral from some of the other horses until he gets acclimated to them and they get acclimated to him. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you have to know. And like I said, I was shamed into being a horse expert. I'm not a horse expert, but I've read a lot about them.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things during my research was horseshoes. And I did an article for Emerging Civil War on this,
Yeah.
the manufacture of horseshoes. And it was a big problem for the South because it would take a farrier a long time, say for a regiment of cavalry, you have 1,000 horses. It would take him at least 1,000 hours of pounding to reshoe these horses. And that's an awful lot of time and an awful lot of iron, or bar iron that you have to get into to the horseshoes. And there was a fellow by the name of Henry Burden who had came up with a horseshoe machine, and he had a number of these in operation during the Civil War, where he could turn out one horseshoe a minute.
Wow.
Yeah, he was really, I mean, they were really pulling them out. And horseshoes come in different sizes. So again, the from what I understand is that it was up in the New England area, and the Confederates wanted to, espionage, wanted to look up and find out how to, steal one, or how does this work, and they never could do that. So the Southern troopers were forced to either get the farrier to find bar iron, which was scarce, or steal horseshoes from the Yankees. And there's also accounts that these Southern troopers, you would see them after a battle, there would be horses' hooves dangling from their saddlebags just for the horses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
lots of different things you learn about it, even not being a horse expert.
Well, you sure fool me.
Well, I wasn't just horsing around, as they say.
But bum. I see
Yeah.
what you did there. Brian, I've really enjoyed the chance to chat with you here and horse around a little bit about Civil War horses.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. This is actually kind of surreal for me because I'm a newbie with the emerging Civil War, but I've been watching your podcast for a number of years. I mean, since COVID, and it's like, geez, I'm on one.
See, look, it's not all that in a bag of chips. It's just,
Yeah, right, right.
well, we look forward to more great contributions from you. We're so delighted to have you as part of the emerging Civil War community, Brian.
Well,
So
thank you very much, Chris. Pleasure being here.
pleasure to have you. I'm Chris Mikowski on behalf of Brian. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.